Good afternoon and welcome to the Senate. Next item on the notice paper, question time. Here's Mr. President.
The Leader of the Government, Senator Button.
Mr. President, I seek leave to make a statement about ministerial arrangements.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, leave is granted.
Mr. President, I inform the Senate that the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Senator Evans, will be absent from the chamber for the remainder of this week. Senator Evans will be attending the 4th Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in Geneva and making brief visits to Cairo, New York and Washington for consultations on the current Gulf crisis. Any questions which would normally be directed to Senator Evans in relation to his portfolio should be directed to Senator Ray.
Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition, Senator Hill.
Well, Mr. President, my questions to the Minister representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Ray, also the Minister for Defence. I must say I'm sorry that Senator Evans couldn't wait until after question time to leave. He was able to launch a book before question time. I ask Senator Ray, how many Australian hostages are being held in each of Kuwait and Iraq? Are Australian hostages being used as human shields to protect military installations? What is the current guidance of the Minister to such hostages to best protect their safety, bearing in mind that the government has given contradictory advice to date? And which other countries have negotiated release of their nationals from the region of conflict, and on what basis?
The Minister representing the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Ray.
Mr. President, I'm not so sure that whether other countries have negotiated release of hostages, but according to an announcement made on Iraqi television on the 19th of August, the National Assembly of Iraq has decided that in some circumstances the citizens of 5 countries, Austria, Finland, Portugal, Sweden and Switzerland, not taking part in, inverted commas, the military blockade, would be allowed to leave Iraq. The status and precise intent of this statement is still not entirely clear. We understand that the governments of some countries concerned have been notified by the Iraqi authorities of the arrangements being made for the departure of their citizens, while other governments have been so far unable to obtain clarification. There is confusion about whether the basis for the selection of the countries whose nationals can leave Iraq relates to the application of sanctions or participation in the multinational naval force, or both. While the countries nominated can be characterised as being amongst those which are applying sanctions, but not participating in the multi-naval force, they are not the only countries with citizens in Kuwait and Iraq which fit that criteria. In other words, non-participation in the MNF would appear not to be the sole criteria for the apparent discrimination between countries. The Australian government is doing all in its power to secure the departure from Iraq and Kuwait of Australian citizens who are at present trapped there, and has repeatedly called on Iraq to respect international law and to leave Iraq and Kuwait. The numbers in Kuwait, I understand, are 72. The Australian consul has been visiting Kuwait and has, I think, made contact with 64. The previous figures of, I think, about 80 in Iraq is our best estimate at this stage. As much as possible, Foreign Affairs is trying to establish the whereabouts of all Australians and to give them the appropriate advice, which Senator Evans went into yesterday. And some of contact will continue to be established with these people via Radio Australia. I might add that I don't think it's appropriate either for the press or for the Parliament to canvass names at this stage. That may only endanger the people in Kuwait. There is no evidence at this stage that we have, Senator Hill, that any Australians are being used as human shields. There is some concern that an Australian resident may have been moved into a very dangerous situation. We're trying to confirm that. Not an Australian passport holder, would be in fact a British citizen as a permanent resident in Australia, and we're endeavouring to make further inquiries as to her fate.
Senator Loosely.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is directed to the Minister for Defence, Senator Ray. Against the background of the deployment of Australian naval units in the Gulf, I ask the Minister, is he aware of suggestions that the Wrigley report on the structure of the Australian Defence Force is to be buried? Is the Minister committed to a comprehensive examination of the report and its recommendations and to a full public debate on the report?
The Minister for Defence, Senator Ray.
Mr. President, I received the Wrigley report in early July. I immediately ordered its printing and public release on August the 1st. I think one of the key recommendations in the Wrigley report was there is a need for much more sustained debate about defence in Australia. And his report, going into the many areas it did, provides a basis for that. And at the time of releasing the report, I indicated a period should be available for full public exposure of the issues raised by Alan Wrigley and discussion therein. I've also authorised Mr. Wrigley to canvass his views and the views contained within his report as widely as possible. That goes to briefing of press, briefing of opposition, right through the academia, etc., to give it the widest possible exposure. I have indicated that obviously the force structure review would also take into account Mr. Wrigley's view. To some extent that, Senator Loosely, has been misinterpreted, that the force structure review would be the sole judge of Mr. Wrigley's report, and I'd like to at least put that down now. I think it's be more appropriate for the process of government to establish an interdepartmental committee with a much wider range of views than merely defence, to comment on the Wrigley report and to recommend its implementation. I've indicated publicly that many aspects of the Wrigley report have an attraction for me as Defence Minister. It's a very well written and well thought out report. It's not necessary that every phrase used in that report is accepted by the Defence Department. Some they would regard as slightly gratuitous insult. But getting away from those 2 or 3 minor objections, it is a report that may well see a reorientation of our approach to defence issues in the 90s. It has much of value in it and much appeal to government in it, but the public debate and processes of debate must continue over the next few months, and then the government will give its response. The alternative approach, Senator Loosely, could have been for government to receive the report, assess it for 8 months and release its findings with it. And if we'd done that particular process, followed that particular process, everyone would have said, why haven't you released the report? Why are you sitting on it, etc. I think we followed the proper process the moment it became available, release it for public debate and get as much input back as possible.
Senator Durack.
Mr. President, my question is also directed to the Minister for Defence. The Minister no doubt recalls that on ABC radio on Monday the 13th of August, he told Paul Murphy that the rules of engagement for Australia's ships going to the Gulf region would be released on Wednesday, that was 2 days later. What, therefore, is the Minister's reaction to the statement on AM this morning by the Prime Minister that anyone who believed the rules of engagement would be made public would be making a stupid assumption, and in fact, if anyone suggested such a course of action, it would show, quote, how little, in fact, they know about these rules, those areas.
The Minister for Defence, Senator Ray.
Mr. President, what I said on the ABC radio was that the rules of engagement would be released. I didn't say released publicly. I've never once, Mr. President. Well, I think it's... Mr. President, I have never once said that they'd be released publicly, but they have to be released. To the captains of the ship. Senator Durack has made a great play, Mr. President. Made a great play in saying the government has been delaying on this issue. We haven't been delaying on this particular issue. We've had the draft rules of engagement prepared for some time. But one of the difficulties we face, and that apparently the opposition don't want to even concede this, with a number of nations involved in the Gulf area, it would be absolutely ridiculous for us to adopt an absolutely definitive set of rules of engagement without discussing it with those other naval forces. Those Those procedures have been underway. The rules of engagement have been transmitted. The rules of engagement have been transmitted to the captains of the ship this morning, with one caveat, that if in fact, in discussions with other countries that we're cooperating in that area, those rules of engagement need to be amended. Well, your cynicism, Senator Hill, is something pathetic. Absolutely pathetic.
Order.
Absolutely pathetic cynicism from you, Senator Hill, and I'm disappointed that you take that particular attitude. Now, returning to the point, Mr. President, those rules of engagement, having been issued to the captains of our vessels, will be subject to change if, in the event, in consultation with other naval powers being involved in the region, it is necessary to make them gel and blend in with other rules of engagement being adopted. Now, that is the position. It was never intended that they be publicly released. I never gave that intention. If Senator Durack wants to so misinterpret it, so be it.
President,
supplementary question.
I'd
Senator
like
Durack.
to ask a supplementary question of the Minister. What grounds did he have on the 13th of August for saying so categorically that they would be released, even if one accepts the absurd definition of release that the Minister has now given? What grounds did you have on that day, the 13th, to say they'd be released on the Wednesday, 2 days later, when it's now taken over a week or more before they've even been released in your sense of the word? And secondly, if and when the government ever makes up its mind about the final details of these rules of engagement, will the Minister make a statement to the Parliament, at least in general terms, as to what limitations are placed on the captains of those ships in engagement situations?
Minister,
The
Senator
second
Ray.
part of Senator Durack's question, of course, is based on a false assumption. He says if and when the government make up their mind. The government has made up their mind, has issued the rules of engagement. But if you expect me, Senator Durack, to issue totally inflexible rules of engagement without amendment from now to the end of the year, given the fluid situation there and given our relationship with other naval groups operating there, you're putting forward a very ridiculous proposition. So in answer to your second part of your question, it's based on a false premise. In terms of the first part of your question, one would have hoped at that time, Senator Durack, if you'll cast your mind back and get over the political pettiness of your question, if you cast your mind back, we had strong hopes of United Nations involvement and that these would be under a United Nations flag. That was the hope, that would come to immediate realisation and we'd be able to issue to our ships rules of engagement consistent with that operational command. That didn't transpire, so one delayed the final drawing up and issuing of those on that basis. It's now become clear that it's less likely, one hopes, not unlikely, but less likely that they're going to be under United Nations command. And so my expectation of being able to do it as quickly as possible, for we all realise that the sooner they're out, the more the ship's crew can practice according to them. Now, the only other point I want to make is and I intended to make it in answer to the first part of your question, I'm quite happy, Senator Durack, to release the rules of engagement to the Leader of the Opposition yourself to study and for comment. That's in my brief. I already had that as a written part to the answer. And so I make that offer for you to read the rules of engagement, come to your own conclusions. But I repeat that when I made that statement they'd be released a week ago, that was predicated on my belief and my hope that it'd be under United Nations control. That hasn't yet transpired. We hope that it does. As the Chief of the Defence Forces said to me this morning, rules of engagement are not the 10 commandments. They can be amended according to circumstances. One should not be totally inflexible in the approach to these matters.
Senator Beam.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question without notice is to the Leader of the Government in the Senate, Senator Button, in his capacity as Minister representing the Treasurer. And I refer to a report in this morning's Australian Financial Review asserting that the government plans to axe the investment promotion program. I ask the Minister, what is the government's intention?
Leader of the Government, Senator Button.
Mr. President, that report in the Financial Review was news to me and news to everybody else, I suspect. But I suppose news is the function of newspapers. But the government is not proposing to terminate this program prematurely. The scheme, under previous government decisions made in the budget context, is to run until the end of 1992-93. 1993. The future of the scheme will be considered closer to this time following a review of its effectiveness. And the scheme you're talking about, Senator, is one in which the government has investment advisors in various places, Japan, North America, Europe, and so on. As I say, the future of the scheme will be considered closer to the time when it is due to expire, that is at the end of 92-93, and there will be a review of its effectiveness in the meantime. This information was conveyed, I might say, to the reporter from the Financial Review who wrote the article in question. The information was conveyed last night.
The Leader of the Australian Democrats, Senator Powell.
Thank you, Mr President. My question, without notice, is to the Leader of the Government in the Senate, Senator Button. I preface my question by noting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former National Security Advisor to former President Carter, fears that a US first strike against Iraq is under consideration and has predicted that, and I quote, carnage, regional explosion and a massive loss of life would result. And I further note that Jody Powell, President Carter's press secretary, has said that the time may come when President Bush must balance the lives of the 20,000 international hostages in Iraq against the West's need to get rid of Saddam. And I ask the Minister, 1, is it the case that a US first strike against Iraq is a real and growing prospect? 2, if so, does this contradict the Bush administration's earlier statements that their Middle East deployment was for defensive purposes only? And 3, does the government accept Mr Brzezinski's prediction that a first strike would have devastating consequences not only for the international hostages but for all people in Kuwait and Iraq? And finally, does the government support US first strike against Iraq?
The Leader of the Government, Senator Button.
Mr President, this is probably a question more appropriately directed to Senator Ray, but let me say that there are all sorts of commentators who are concerned about, of course, as each member of the Senate is, each member of the Australian community is, about the situation in the Middle East. The whole world is concerned about that situation, and in that circumstance, a variety of commentators will be offering views. Now, I don't think it is appropriate for me to conduct a commentary on the views of commentators around the world about whether the United States is in any section of the administration bent on a first strike activity against Iraq or not. Certainly, if the war in the Middle East, or the circumstances in the Middle East as they currently exist were to escalate, I agree totally that the consequences would be very serious for people in that region, and indeed for those countries which are involved. And anybody has to agree with that conclusion and hope that it will not happen. The consequences, as you put it in your question, would be devastating. But let me say that this government has made a commitment, together with the United States and other countries, to a role in the Gulf in the pursuit of the arrangements which have been put in place to try and alter the course of the Iraq government's apparent intentions. And that does not make us a party to certain views which might be being canvassed in sections of the United States administration or otherwise. And it's not a matter upon which I can comment.
Supplementary question,
Supplementary.
Mr. President.
Senator Powell.
I would like to ask again of the Leader of the Government, and I stress that this is in his capacity as representing the Prime Minister in this chamber, rather than a question for a Minister for Defence. The final part of my question: does the government support a US first strike in Iraq?
The Minister, Senator Button.
Mr. President, the government's position in relation to Australia's involvement in the Gulf has been articulated on a number of occasions by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Minister for Defence and others. And I can add nothing to what I said in answer to the first part of the question, I do not believe that the United States government has consulted further with the Australian government at this stage about further developments in the Gulf.
Senator Harradine.
Mr. President, my question is directed to Senator Button, Minister for Industry and Commerce, and in his capacity also as representing the Treasurer in this place. I refer to a letter in the Canberra Times of the 13th of July, written by the late Brian O'Neill, a great Tasmanian and indeed a great Australian, pointing out that the tax pact which was received by every Australian taxpayer was in fact printed largely on foreign paper, imported paper. Is it a fact that the bulk of this document is printed on supercalendered and uncoated mechanical paper product, and which is not available in Australia, and that the forms, except for the forms which were printed on Glopac, which is available in Australia? Is it also a fact that there are Australian-made paper products which are designed for precisely the same purposes as the tax pack? And I give an example, Econoprint and Offset magazine, which are made on the northwest coast of Tasmania, namely at Wesley Vale. Will the Minister respond to the Senate and tell the Senate why did the government go for a foreign product when similar products were available from Australian manufacturers, and will the Minister give an assurance that next year this tax pack will be printed and published in Australia, as it was on this occasion, but on Australian-made paper?
The Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce, Senator Button.
Mr. President, I must say this question reminds me a bit of a question I was asked on the radio the other day when the interviewer said to me, are you aware, Senator, that there was a customs shipment which came into Melbourne, and because the particular articles being shipped into the port of Melbourne had 4 additional bolts on them, the customs rejected them and said they had to pay a higher rate of duty? And is this not, Senator, an inefficiency, a considerable inefficiency in the administration of customs and a moral problem for Australia? I mean, that was the essence of the question. To which I had to plead, I must say, a fair degree of ignorance, because I was not familiar with the particular circumstances. I have to do that again here, Senator. I'm not aware of the paper on which the particular documents to which you refer was printed. I am, of course, aware that a number of grades of paper are not made in Australia and are imported. I'm aware of the fact that we have a very substantial deficit in paper products because of the fact that we don't make a complete range of papers in Australia, and also because we don't produce sufficient volume. But insofar as the particular question which you asked me on relating to a particular document and the availability of substitute or alternative Australian papers, well, I'll direct that question to the Minister administering the appropriate department. I'm not even sure who that is at the moment, and I'll provide you with an... Well, Senator Hill says he's not surprised. I mean, it all depends whether the Department of Administrative Services made the purchase or the Treasury made the purchase. I'm unable to say at this point of time, but I'll find out, and I'll not only be hopefully able to enlighten you, Senator Harradine, but Senator Hill en passant, as the French say.
Leader of the National Party, Senator Boswell.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question without notice is to Senator Tate.
Order.
I asked the Minister whether last night's budget announcement that the tax file number system will be massively extended to cover all social security, veterans affairs and student assistance is a complete dumping of his government's promise in 1988 that for privacy reasons the tax file number would not be extended beyond the tax system.
The Minister representing the Minister for Community Services and Health, Senator Tate.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Senator Boswell has raised a very important issue, namely the relationship between the efficiency of the discharge of government programs and the obligation that governments have to taxpayers to ensure that money spent on programs are in fact directed well to the target recipients. But there is a privacy issue, and I've been assured by the various ministers concerned that it's their intention that Mr Kevin O'Connor, the Privacy Commissioner, be involved in the monitoring of the way in which these particular provisions work. It is very, very important, Mr President, that that particular balance be found, as I say, in order to protect the revenue on the one hand and to protect the privacy of individuals on the other. And I'm very confident that Kevin O'Connor, the Commissioner for Privacy, has the confidence of this chamber and will be able to report to this chamber if he finds that there has been any adverse impacts resulting from the operation of the matters to which Senator Boswell has drawn our attention.
Supplementary, Senator Boswell.
Doesn't the budget announcement concerning the wider application of the tax file number system simply represent the third attempt by the Hawke government to impose a personal identification numbering system on Australians? The first attempt being the Australian card, the second the recently aborted Health Insurance Commission proposal to link pharmacies with a number of government department databases.
Minister, Senator Tate.
Well, Mr President, it may be helpful if I gave a little more detail on that requirement for income support recipients to supply a tax file number. And I believe that the thought that this amounts to an Australia card enhancement will be found to be without proper foundation. Because one will recall, Mr President, the Australia card proposal was for a national identification system covering all Australians, with some exceptions. Its main intention was to prevent tax evasion, and its use would have become an integral part of life in Australia, including employment arrangements, financial transactions, contractual arrangements of various types. It was a most comprehensive proposal. Well, the measure announced in the budget last night falls far short of this. Its purpose is to connect the revenue and income support records in a way which strengthens the income test requirements, which surround most income support payments currently available in Australia. The measure does not apply to all Australians. It applies only to those people who are clients of the agencies mentioned in the budget papers. The measure is not intended to detect tax evasion, but rather to ensure that income support payments are based correctly on the amount of other income derived by the recipients. Mr President, the Department of Social Security and the other agencies involved already undertake independent checks of these amounts of other income, but the process is manual and very costly. The budget measure takes advantage of developments in computing technology so that the necessary checks can be made at minimum cost. As I've indicated, the intended arrangements have been and will continue to be discussed with the Privacy Commissioner and will be subject to constant monitoring by him to ensure that the privacy principles are met in every respect.
Senator Alston.
Mr President, I direct a question to Senator Bolkus, the Minister for Administrative Services. Has the Minister's attention been drawn to reports that the old Parliament House is being neglected and allowed to deteriorate? Does the Minister agree that the old Parliament House is worthy of preservation for its significant role in the parliamentary history of this nation? If so, what action does the government propose to ensure that this important building is secured for present and future generations of Australians?
The Minister for Administrative Services, Senator Bolkus.
Thank you, Mr President. I have in fact seen reports that Senator Colston alludes to, that the old Parliament House is, as is claimed, being allowed to deteriorate. I think at the outset it should be made very clear and succinctly that those allegations are in fact erroneous. No one expects... I have been down for an inspection and I didn't go down there with blinkered glasses either. The reality of the case is that we are talking about an old building.
They were there before, Grant.
Order. Order. Senator Bolkus.
Mr President, we are talking about an old building. We can't expect it to appear as new. And of course, once furniture and individuals are removed from it, then there is a case to ensure that on a care and maintenance basis the building is maintained at a proper level. The government is also concerned to ensure that the building has a future and has already decided that the future of the old Parliament House will be, once it is refurbished, to create a museum of constitutional and political history. I also, Mr President, alert the Senate to the fact that in the budget last night, the government has boosted funding to the old Parliament House fourfold. We have maintained, in fact we have increased the amount of monies allocated for the continuing care and maintenance of old Parliament House. It is now going to be $700,000 for this financial year, an increase of $200,000 over last year's level. But we've also allocated $1.35 million, and that money will be used to develop detailed design options for the building to return the old Parliament House to its 1927 configuration for use as a public building. This, Mr. President, reflects the government's commitment to continuing to maintain the building, but also towards moving towards having it ultimately as a constitutional political museum. I should also, Mr. President, in this context, repeat and put on record the government's decision that the old Parliament House will be used for a number of purposes within this broad definition of constitutional political history museum. It will be used for the National Museum of Australia, the Australian Electoral Commission's Education Centre. It will also house a Government Information Centre. As well as that, it will also house the Australian Heritage Commission, and it will also be made available to the Australian Archives to display some of their most significant artistic and written records that the archives have in their possession. Mr. President, in closing, I do ask the Senate to note that there has been an increase in funding allocated in last night's budget, and in terms of the $1.35 million for the design option work, the detailed design option work, I think it can be seen that this is the first step towards the old Parliament House achieving its final use.
Senator Alston.
President, my question is to the Minister for Social Security, Senator Richardson. I refer to last night's budget announcement that the introduction of a $2.50 charge for pharmaceuticals for holders of pensioner health benefit and health benefit cards will be offset by a corresponding increase of $2.50 a week for standard rate pensioners and beneficiaries. Does the Minister acknowledge that there are currently many thousands of elderly pensioners in nursing homes, retirement villages and hostels who pay a high and fixed proportion of their income for rent and board, and that such people will lose a large proportion of their increased payment in increased rent and board? If this is so, what steps does the government propose to take to ensure that these people are properly compensated?
The Minister for Social Security, Senator Richardson.
Thanks very much, Mr. President. I think there are two problems, Senator Alston. There's the problem concerning nursing homes. There's also, I think, the problem of looking at what state housing commissions might do with the $2.50 increase in terms of the rent charge to tenants. So we've got a twofold problem. Insofar as those nursing homes that are subsidised by the Commonwealth, then I think we'll be able to quarantine all the pensioners in those homes from suffering any disadvantage because of last night's decision. In respect of those homes that are private, we will be contacting those homes. We'll be negotiating with them, and we are very hopeful that they will not be taking into account that pension increase in terms of taking money off the nursing home patients, most of whom I think pay 85%. In respect of state housing commissions, the same will apply. We'll be negotiating with them over the next few weeks and months, and we are, Senator Alston, very confident that the states will not take advantage of this situation either, and that no pensioner will be disadvantaged by the decision.
Senator Giles.
Mr. President, my question is for the Minister for Social Security. Is the Minister aware of a recent article in the Sydney Morning Herald which said that some accountants and lawyers would advocate income minimisation practices to attempt to reduce non-custodial parents' liabilities under Stage 2 of the Child Support Scheme?
The Minister for Social Security, Senator Richardson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Giles, for Senator Pendista's education, and I think those of us who have been here for a while know that he needs quite a bit of it. This did not come from a Labor lawyer, Senator. This came from one of those smart, very clever lawyers from a very big firm, the kind of people who support you, Senator. And I tell you what, there's nothing cheap about this kind of lawyer. It takes Liberal Party people to be able to support them.
Order.
And unfortunately, it showed, Mr. President, that there were plenty of non-custodial parents prepared to conspire with lawyers to affect how children in Australia can live. to minimise the amount of money that can be provided for kids. And that's a pretty miserable performance. Now, this particular lawyer was giving advice on how income might be minimised so that non-custodial parents just wouldn't have to pay up. The whole direction of the Child Support Agency and the government's reforms in the last few years has been to make both parents contribute to the bringing up of their kids. That is the only way you can have a sane, sensible, sound social security system. And people like this lawyer deserve the condemnation of everyone in this Senate. All they are doing is seeking to inflict misery on the kids by artificially protecting non-custodial parents. And that kind of thing deserves the support of no one here, only condemnation.
Senator Short.
Mr. President, my question is to Senator Button, representing the Treasurer. And I ask, does the Minister agree that outlays by the federal government for its own expenditure purposes this year, after the proper net deduction of asset sales and public debt interest, are budgeted to increase by 11.9% in money terms, 5.4% in real terms? If so, could he explain how such a profligate increase can be described by the Treasurer, as he did in his budget speech, as, and I quote, maintaining fiscal policy as the government's principal weapon in the fight against the current account deficit and our overseas debt?
The Minister representing the Treasurer, Senator Button.
Mr. President, the Senator Short knows full well, and I guess finds unpalatable, this government has had an outstanding record of restraint in government outlays, something which was never done in the entire period of previous governments. And that's so over the last 4 years. And what this budget does, of course, is maintain the fiscal discipline of recent years at a time when there would naturally be a tendency for outlays to rise and revenue to fall as a result of a slowdown in the Australian economy. Outlays to rise, as they are anticipated to do, for example, in relation to unemployment benefits, revenue to fall for a variety of reasons, which are articulated in the budget papers. But the budget surplus this year is larger than any on record. It's been brought about by both a fall in outlays to GDP and a fall in revenue to GDP. And outlays to GDP this year anticipated to be 23.5%, down from 23.6% last year. I mean, that is surely the most relevant measure of outlays, Senator. You have to look at the total economy and look at the pattern of Commonwealth government outlays as against the performance of the total economy. Now, we are not saying that in this budget there has been fiscal slashing, if you like, of the same vigour as this government has indulged in previous budgets. But what we are saying, Senator, is that we've maintained over a period of years a degree of fiscal discipline and restraint in Commonwealth government expenditure which is unsurpassed in the history of this country. And we've done that for very obvious reasons of budget strategy. And those figures are all set out in the budget statements.
Senator Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to Senator Richardson, Minister for Arts, Sports, the Environment, Tourism and Territories. On this day when the Parliament is first being televised, my question concerns the continuing insufficient media coverage and sponsorship of women's sport. Can the Minister outline the government's initiatives to promote the role of women in sport, both at the elite level and in the community, and in particular steps to ensure equity in the allocation of the sporting dollar?
The Minister representing the Minister for Sport, Senator Richardson.
Thanks very much, Mr. President. Senator Crowley has had a continuing interest in this question over quite some time, and as well she might, because all of the research that's been done in this country in the last few years suggests that women, and adolescent girls in particular, are not participating in sport in anything like the rest of the community. And we Of course your girls will be all right, Senator Harradine. You're just so enlightened in these matters. But there are those who don't have your advantages.
You can field a team.
There are also quite a few Australians who don't have as many kids as you. Now, for the rest of us who are looking at attempting to increase those participation rates, there is a serious problem. Now, some time back, the Sports Commission set up the Women's Sports Promotion Unit, which has been working away at lifting the profile of women in sport for quite some time. But recently, Mr. President, the government has developed 2 other initiatives to promote women in sport. At a meeting of Sports and Recreation Ministers in New Zealand last week, the Sports and Recreation Ministers Council established an official subcommittee which will enhance the coordination between the states and the Commonwealth on the role of women in sport. It'll have representatives from New Zealand, from the federal government and from all the states and territories to provide advice on the coordination of policies between all of those bodies. The Council also endorsed the principles and the policies of equity in sport and endorsed the work of the Women's Sport Promotion Unit in trying to achieve that. As a complementary initiative, Mrs Kelly, our new Minister for Sport, is establishing the Independent Sportswomen of Excellence Committee, which will be launched on the 10th of September. Now, this committee will have 3 purposes. It will act as a role model for adolescent girls. It will raise the profile of women in sport and obtain media coverage and financial support for women's sport as a whole. The committee will be made up of some very prominent women in sport from around Australia. Some of them will be indeed household names. It will not be an advisory committee, as that is what the Women's Sport Promotion Unit already is, but it will be a lobby group which will promote women in sport and get more publicity for it than perhaps the Sports Promotion Unit will have been able to do. By doing that, we'll continue to raise that profile and we will get the participation rate of women and in particular adolescent girls up to where it ought to be.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is directed to Senator Tate, representing the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Can the Minister advise what reduction in government spending will be achieved by the new initiative which requires veterans in long-term psychiatric care to pay $145.25 a week, whereas previously they were cared for by their government, which properly recognised that their war-inflicted conditions merited care without cost to them? Is this mean decision of the Minister for Veterans Affairs part of Senator Richardson's strategy of cutting down on welfare cheats?
The Minister representing the Minister for Veterans Affairs, Senator Tate.
Mr. Chairman, there would be no suggestion by the Minister for Veterans Affairs that he would be treating veterans as cheats or even making that surmise in any financial arrangements that are made in relation to their paying a contribution towards board and lodging costs when they are admitted to long-term psychiatric care. Veterans Affairs beneficiaries admitted to long-term psychiatric care in gazetted mental health beds and residents of Anzac Hostel in Victoria, it is true, will be required to pay a contribution towards board and lodging costs from the 1st of January 1991. Nursing home residents have been required to pay such a contribution since 1987. The change will bring residents in long-term psychiatric care and in Anzac Hostel into line with nursing home residents. These expenses are incurred by all veterans in nursing homes and other long-term institutional care. The contribution will be set at the same rate as that applying to nursing home residents. This is currently $20.75 per day, which is 87.5% of the maximum single-rate pension plus rent assistance. The contribution will be linked to increases in Veterans Affairs and Social Security pensions. Before the 1st of January 1991, Mr. President, residents affected by the change will be individually notified and suitable payment methods will be determined.
Senator Reynolds.
Mr. President, I address my question to Senator Tate, the Minister representing the Minister for Health. Can the Minister confirm whether the Australian Drug Evaluation Committee is currently able to meet only 6 days per year? Is it correct that there were an estimated 200 applications before the last meeting for consideration and only 18 were approved? What can be done to upgrade resources for the committee so that its role can be considerably improved and evaluations of many important drugs greatly expedited?
The Minister representing the Minister for Community Services and Health, Senator Tate.
Mr. President, I don't have any details on the exact proportion of drugs which could be evaluated over a series of meetings by the Drug Evaluation Committee. though I accept that Senator Reynolds would have had accurate information as the basis for her question. But, Mr. President, I believe that the question of drug evaluation is a matter of great importance to the Australian community, and one which is subject to some campaigns from time to time suggesting that the process be speeded up in a way which might lead to the entrance into Australia of drugs which are then found at some later date to have a deleterious impact on the health of those persons who might think that they could benefit from a drug that's been well publicised perhaps overseas, and where doctors become aware through reading overseas medical journals of the claims being made about a particular drug. And there's no doubt that these wonder drugs are subject to considerable publicity and raise the hopes of those suffering from a particular disease or illness in a way which leads them, of course, to want the most speedy process of evaluation to take place. But I'm sure Senator Reynolds, as a woman, that you would be perhaps very well aware of the dangers that have faced women where drugs have been introduced in a way which has a very deleterious effect on their health, whereas, of course, it was hoped that they would be beneficial. Mr. President, the information which must be submitted by manufacturers wishing to market drugs in Australia is similar in both structure and level of detail to that required by other developed countries, and specific Australian trials are generally not required. And I believe that in that situation, it means that our regulatory process is in harmony with the best practice of those well-developed overseas countries. And I believe that while there may be opportunities for improving the regulatory process, and I believe dialogue with industry and doctors should continue to try and speed up that process, I believe that the evaluation system is a very vital protection for the public and can't be speeded up in a way which could lead, as I say, to the entrance of drugs into the community, which could in fact do damage.
Senator Reid.
Mr. President, my question is to you.
Order. Supplementary. Senator Reynolds.
Supplementary question, Mr. President. Senator Tate, you mention overseas comparisons. Could you undertake to contact the Minister for Health and request comparative information about the time of processing approvals and compare Australia with those other countries?
Minister, Senator Tate.
Well, I'll undertake to follow up the matter with the relevant minister, Mr. President, but I might point out that at a recent international seminar in Jakarta, Dr. Leo Offerhaus of the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe stated that Australia was one of a limited number of countries whose drug evaluation system provided adequate protection for the public. It's that sort of international comparison that I think Senator Reynolds and the general public would like to know about. And I think we can take great heart from that evaluation by the World Health Organization. But as to the precise details, Senator, that you wish to have provided, I'll ask the Minister to provide those.
Senator Reid.
Mr. President, my question is to you. Was there significant damage done to public property at a function in Parliament House last evening? Is it true that a painting was damaged? If so, whose party was it, and what action is being taken to recover from the perpetrators the costs of the damage to public property?
I can inform Senator Reid and all senators that both the Speaker and I are appalled at the wanton act to deliberately deface a painting by noted Australian artist Fred Williams. My understanding is that the private dining room was booked by the Treasury Department as the venue for their annual post-budget Treasury drinks, and I assume that department issued the invitations. At 2:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd of August, the catering supervisor at the function called security staff to remove the painting after beer had apparently been thrown at it and food and cream had been smeared on it. The art curator is now assessing the damage to the painting, but the initial estimate is that it will cost at least $500 to clean. The final figure can only be made after a full examination has been carried out and a detailed assessment made. Honourable senators can be reassured that every effort will be made to find the culprits, and cost recovery issue has already been raised with the Treasurer, who was equally appalled by what has happened. Neither the Speaker nor I, who have joint responsibility for the building, were at the function. Thankfully, neither of us received an invitation. It is clear that we will have to look very closely at whether Parliament House facilities will be available again next year for the Treasury Department, and I will report further to honourable senators when I have more information. Senator Valentine.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is addressed to the Minister for Defence. I ask the Minister if it is true that the Department of Defence gave permission to Hawker de Havilland to sell $850,000 worth of aircraft parts to the Iraqi Air Force, and that this deal was only cancelled after the invasion of Kuwait. I ask the Minister why the deal received approval in the first place and when the decision was made to allow military exports to Iraq. I further ask the Minister if this deal coincided with the decision to allow the Department of Defence to review military export sales rather than the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which happened in 1988. In addition to this, what other military exports, if any, have been made to Iraq since 1988 or to any other country in the Gulf region? I also ask if it is true that the decision by the Department of Defence to allow the export of former RAAF Mirages to Pakistan caused great embarrassment to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade on his recent visit to the Indian subcontinent. Finally, I ask if any of the companies which sold weapons to Iraq that are now likely to be used against Australian and Allied forces in the Gulf were present at the ADEX 89 Arms Bazaar held here in Canberra last November with Australian government support, and which companies are now being invited to take part in ADEX 91 in November next year. I refer particularly to the French company...
Order. Senator Valentine, it's a very long question.
I'll leave it at that, Mr. President.
Thank you. Good long question. The Minister for Defence, Senator Ray.
Well, Mr. President, at the time of the invasion of Kuwait, there was one permission relating to goods, and this related to a quantity of engine spare parts for Iraqi Air Force trainer aircraft being supplied by Hawker de Havilland. Military advice was given in accordance with procedures agreed by ministers that the goods were not of major military significance. It was therefore consistent with government policy that the goods be exported. The decision was to allow this one exemption was made on the 28th of May 1990 and, as you've indicated in your question, subsequently cancelled on the invasion of Kuwait as part of our trade sanctions. In answer to the second part of your question, the answer is basically no. The Department of Defence is not the sole authority to approve export applications. This is clear in the public guidelines, a copy of which was provided by my department to you last year, but you may not have recalled what was in it. Government departments and authorities represented on the Standing Interdepartmental Committee on Defence Exports use the government's 7 criteria listed in those public guidelines. I can assure you that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are consulted in matters relating to exports. In relation to your third question, there have been no other military exports to Iraq since 1988. Approvals for military exports during the same period to other Gulf countries includes the following items: 7.62mm rifles and spares to Bahrain, demolition firing device to Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, repairs and overhauls of a T-53 aircraft engines for Oman, 1 demonstration Land Rover to Oman, 1 indoor shooting range to Qatar, and radio equipment and spares to Oman and the United Arab Emirates. On the final part of your question, I'll leave that to my colleague, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, to determine whether in fact he was embarrassed. I have to say, though, that the agreement of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is always obtained in regard to the disposal of surplus defence equipment, including the sale of Mirages to Pakistan. The signing of the contract was the culmination of commercial negotiations that started in late 1988. Now, Australia does value its friendship with both India and Pakistan and would not like to take any action that could in any way impair those relationships. I think the last part of your question, Senator, relates to the ADIX. My response there is that the Australian government is not necessarily aware of any foreign companies which have sold weapons to Iraq. However, I have to note that ADEX is a privately run exhibition. No Australian companies, whether present or not at ADEX, have sold weapons to Iraq since 1988, consistent with my previous question. The only other company, not an Australian company, that may have had dealings there that we would know of is Aerospatiale, who may have sold Exocet missiles prior to the ADEX conference, not post the ADEX conference. May I say in conclusion, Mr President, it's very easy to take cheap shots on defence exports, but I've often wondered why people distinguish between the morality of being able to export defence items, but you're able to import them, therefore making those that export them to you immoral. I don't see anything wrong, I never have, in defence exports, but one must, and this country does, as you know, Senator Valentine, to bar exports to certain regions of the world, to certain countries of the world, and so we should. Those guidelines, as I say, are publicly available, and I think we should stick to them.
Senator Peterbone.
Mr President, my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Community Services and Health. Since an Estimates Committee has received confirmation that regulations are being prepared to permit certain trainees in the family medicine program to be accorded higher rebates, or their principals to be accorded higher rebates for services they render as if they were vocationally registered general practitioners, and since the Senate has a select committee examining this matter, and since we have had confirmation further that those draft regulations have been shown to the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners as part of the process of the regulation, I asked the Minister, have the draft regulations been shown to other interested parties? And I asked the Minister further, would he ask his colleague to arrange, as a matter of courtesy to the Senate, to have the Senate Select Committee offered the same courtesies as has been offered to the College, and allow that committee to see and comment on the draft regulations before they are advanced to a stage of finality?
The Minister representing the Minister for Community Services and Health, Senator Tate.
Mr President, I understand Senator Peterbone's interest in this matter, and I understand him to indicate that the College of General Practitioners was consulted, if you like, in order to ensure that the framework of the regulations and their wording was appropriate to the aims which the government has set forward. I don't know whether any other organisations have been consulted in the same way, and I certainly undertake to raise with the Minister the question of the Select Committee being provided with the same opportunity in relation to the formulation of these regulations.
Senator Calder.
President, my question is directed to Senator Button as Leader of the Government in the Senate. And I preamble the question by saying that on the 10th of May I asked Senator Button a question about the multifunction policy, in reply to which Senator Button said, and I quote, "The government has made it quite clear from the beginning that the private sector essentially has the economic carriage of this project. That is to say, government resources will not be poured into it," end of quote. In view of the success of the Queensland Government in avoiding the imposition of the MFP on that state, because the Queensland Government could not or would not provide $320 million for land acquisition, does Senator Button believe he misled the Senate in his reply on the 10th of May? And in relation to the same matter, is he aware that the MFP committee made it quite clear to the Queensland Government that the capital gain in the land value had to accrue to the MFP project to make it economically viable? And secondly, is he aware that the South Australian Government is suggesting that the MFP public cost will be about $2.5 billion? The federal government in yesterday's budget put aside $4 million for MFP expenditure. In view of these very large anticipated government expenditures, does he not agree again that he misled the Senate in his reply on the 10th of May?
The Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce, Senator
Mr.
Button.
President, I didn't mislead the Senate on the 10th of May. I did say that government resources, and I quote, and I think you've referred to it again, will not be poured into the MFP. And that is... we're talking about a project of large resources, Senator, and certainly government resources will not be poured into that. I used an example on the 10th of May to explain the nature of the government investment in the project. That investment has not only been government, it's been private sector investment and state government investment, also Commonwealth investment. But as far as the Commonwealth is concerned, it would largely be made through contributions to the research and education elements of the MFP, in the same way in which we normally contribute to research funds, to universities and so on. Insofar as Senator Colt raises the question of the Queensland site, let me just say that the Joint Steering Committee and the chairman of that committee, Mr. Bailey, were concerned to see that there was not land speculation at the Queensland site. That was the point which they sought to ensure. The land being held by private owners, they were concerned that the price of the land be frozen and should not be a subject for speculation. Of course, Commonwealth funds will be expended in completing the feasibility study in the next stage to determine commercial feasibility, environmental assessment issues and social impact issues, and those are the matters in respect of which money has been allocated by the Commonwealth in this budget for this financial year. The task of the Management Committee at the present time will be to identify the elements of public cost and how to handle that issue of public cost, particularly in relation to collaboration with the private sector. The funds will be the Commonwealth contribution towards the detailed feasibility work at the Adelaide site. They will be concerned with international investment promotion efforts and, most importantly, community consultation issues. I understand when Senator Coulter raised this question on the last occasion, he was keen that the community consultation process should start. Well, Senator Coulter started his own consultation process. That's been done by him in Adelaide by calling meetings and public rallies as a way of consulting. That has also been done in Melbourne by the League of Rights, one or two other bodies like that, the Rainbow Alliance, and Senator Coulter is doing it in South Australia. We prefer, as a Commonwealth government, the more appropriate course of a widespread and intensive consultation process, which will be managed by Mr Bob Lansdowne, the current chairman of Australia Post, a former distinguished public servant, a distinguished ex-serviceman, and one I think who is very committed to trying to provide as much information as possible and to consult with all those groups who have questions or concerns. I just hope that Senator Coulter might get behind these efforts and that he will do so as soon as possible. Mr President, I ask that further questions be placed on notice.
No, sir.
Well, the time allotted for questions has now expired and the Senate will go on with its business. You will have noticed that the issues that are concerning us as a community were reflected in the questions and the answers given by the senators today. By the way, the House of Representatives also sitting today, and its question time parallels that of the Senate, but it's recorded by the Parliamentary Broadcast Network, so if you'd like to hear it, you're able to tonight at 7:15 Australian Eastern Time. That's provided you're able to hear the Parliamentary Broadcast Network. We've been asked our first question, why do we see ministers writing? Well, you will have noticed that many of the questions are fairly long and contain many points, and so it's necessary for a minister to jot down those points before giving his answer. Hope you can join us again tomorrow in the Senate for live question time. Good afternoon to you.
Federal government's